are you the one still grinding while everyone else is already halfway home? You were told hard work is the only path, yet you're falling behind every single day. It feels like you're running a race on a treadmill that's rigged against you. You're putting in soul-crushing effort, but the needle simply isn't moving. You put in 12 brutal hours of sweat, but your results look like someone's lazy afternoon. You might think you just need more grit, but that's the trap. You see, the heavy mental fog you're feeling isn't a sign of hard work. It's a warning that your hustle is actually destroying your future. Your exhaustion isn't a trophy of success. It's the price of a dull axe. I'm going to show you how to stop swinging that blade and finally master the law of leverage. This is the strategic survival guide that will save your career and change how you work forever. We're going to bridge the gap between your effort and the life you actually deserve. But before we find the solution, you need to understand the hidden force that keeps the most dedicated people at the bottom of the mountain, while others glide to the top. There is a specific, invisible weight you've been carrying that isn't even yours. And if you don't drop it in the next few minutes, no amount of effort will ever be enough. Ever notice how the ones carrying the heaviest loads often stay stuck at the bottom? There's a common belief that suffering is the only currency that buys a better life. People walk around with dark circles under their eyes like they're wearing a crown. But if exhaustion were the goal, the most broken would be the most successful. It's a bitter truth. You can give your all and still come up empty-handed. You're skipping sleep, missing out on the good stuff, and putting in 18-hour days, yet the needle hasn't moved an inch toward your big dreams. Think of a woodsman swinging a dull blade against a thick trunk until his hands bleed. He's proud of the blisters, looking at his resting neighbors as if they're lazy. But at the end of the day, his tree is still standing while he's just plain spent. Most people are so busy swinging the axe they don't have time to sharpen it. But here's the chilling reality most hustlers refuse to face. That woodsman isn't just tired, he's actually sabotaging his own survival. In a moment, I'm going to introduce you to Thomas, a man who took this pride in pain to a deadly extreme. You'll see exactly where your loyalty to the struggle is leading you. But more importantly, you'll discover the one thing Thomas was missing that allowed his rival to succeed while barely breaking a sweat. And trust me, it's not what you think. Meet Thomas. Thomas was the kind of guy who thought a backache was a badge of honor. Every morning, before the sun even blinked, he'd grab 2 massive wooden buckets and march up those 1,000-stone steps, his muscles screaming for a single moment's rest. To him, if the work wasn't painful, it simply didn't count. He made it a point to be the first one at the well and the last to leave. You'd hear his boots thumping on the rock long after the other monks were gone. He chose the heaviest load and the coldest stone floor for his bed. Thomas wore his extreme fatigue like a shiny gold medal, even when his eyes were stinging with sweat and he looked like he'd been dragged through a hedge. He was essentially trying to cut down a forest with a spoon because he claimed he didn't have time to find a saw. But despite all that movement, his heart felt as heavy as the water he carried. He was working harder than anyone, yet he felt further from the truth than ever. Thomas was convinced that his suffering was the only way to prove his worth, but he was blind to the fact that he was carrying weights he was never meant to hold. However, while Thomas was breaking his body, someone else was watching him from above, a man who seemed to have found a shortcut that defied everything Thomas believed in. You're about to see the shocking difference between a man who fights the mountain and a man who makes the mountain work for him. But why was Richard so relaxed while the monastery was thriving? The answer lies in a secret Richard held in his pocket, something Thomas wouldn't see until it was almost too late. Then there was Richard. Richard was an older monk who seemed to have mastered the art of doing nothing at all. While Thomas was red-faced and gasping for air, Richard spent his mornings watching the dew evaporate or sitting by a stream, looking entirely too relaxed. To a grinder like Thomas, Richard's slow pace looked like a total waste of a workday. But here's the kicker. Whenever the monastery faced a real crisis, they never called for the man with the buckets. They sought out Richard, whose mind was as sharp as a freshly honed razor. He could solve complex riddles or draft masterpieces while Thomas was still struggling on step 50. Richard wasn't just getting by. He was operating from a place of supreme mental leverage. He didn't have calloused hands or a hunched back, yet his results were 10 times more valuable. The difference was simple. Thomas was digging a trench with his fingernails, while Richard was using a machine he'd built in the silence Thomas was too busy to hear. Richard had refined his personal system so well that the heavy lifting happened almost entirely behind the scenes. But Thomas couldn't see the machine. He only saw a man he thought was lazy. Little did he know, a massive disaster was about to strike the mountain that would prove Richard's laziness was actually the only thing that could save them. And when that moment comes, you'll see the exact point where hard work becomes a death sentence. Then the heat came, a relentless baking sun that turned the monastery's green hills into brittle straw. The wells Thomas relied on for his daily penance finally sighed and surrendered to the dust. While panic rippled through the monastery, Thomas saw this as his golden opportunity to shine. He decided that if the water was further away, he'd just have to push himself twice as hard. He set his sights on a distant river miles away, doubling the size of the buckets on his shoulders. His logic was simple. If effort didn't work, you just keep doubling down until the world gives in. He was essentially trying to outrun a wildfire while carrying lead weights. But the human body isn't a machine. Halfway up the mountain, his knees buckled with a sickening crack against the dry stone. The precious water he'd nearly died to fetch disappeared into the thirsty, ungrateful dirt. Thomas lay there in a heap, realizing his all simply wasn't enough to beat the laws of physics. In that moment of total collapse, he understood a terrifying truth. His pride in the struggle had left the people he loved parched and helpless. He had reached his absolute limit, and his hard work had bought him nothing but a front-row seat to his own defeat. But as the sun dipped low, a shadow fell over him. It was Richard, the man who hadn't broken a sweat. Richard was about to reveal why Thomas's exhaustion was actually a choice, and he was holding something in his hand that would make Thomas realize he had been fighting a war he was never meant to win. But what was this small object, and how could it do more work than 1,000 brutal steps? The answer is the only reason some people retire at 30, while others die at their desks. Thomas looked up through a haze of salt and stinging sweat, his vision blurred by pure exhaustion. There stood Richard, leaning casually against the parched stone of the well as if he'd just woken from a nap. While Thomas was a wreck of trembling limbs and ragged breath, Richard looked like he'd been chilling in the shade. It was a bitter pill to swallow for a man who thought his suffering made him more deserving of success. "I gave my blood to these steps," Thomas croaked, his voice cracking like the dry earth beneath his feet. "Why is my spirit still thirsty while you remain as cool as a spring breeze?" He was angry at the injustice, not yet realizing he'd been his own most cruel and stubborn prison guard. With a heavy thud, Thomas finally let those massive wooden buckets drop to the ground. They weren't just containers for water anymore. They were the clunky symbols of an ego that thrived on being the hardest worker. He'd spent his life carrying a heavy load just to prove he could, rather than thinking about how to move it. It's a funny thing how we cling to our struggles like they're treasures, even when they're the very things drowning us. Broken and humbled, Thomas finally whispered, "Show me." He was ready to drop the pride that had kept his axe dull, and his progress stalled for far too long. Richard reached into his robe and pulled out a small, peculiar object. He was about to reveal the first secret of true leverage, a secret that explains why working 10x harder often results in 10x less progress. But to understand it, Thomas first had to look through something that seemed completely broken. What he saw next changed his perception of reality forever, and it's the same distortion that is currently blinding you to the easy path. Richard pulled a small glass lens from his pocket and placed it into Thomas's trembling, blistered hand. The glass was caked in a thick layer of gray dust, making the world look like a muddy, hopeless blur. "Go ahead," Richard said with a smirk. "Press it harder against your eye and tell me what you see." It was a ridiculous request, yet it mirrored exactly how Thomas had been treating his life for a decade. No matter how much pressure Thomas applied, the image remained an impenetrable mess. He was exhausting his physical energy to compensate for a tool that was simply too dirty to do its job. Richard took the lens back and gently wiped it clean. "Your hard work is the dust, Thomas," he explained. "You think more effort will clear the view, but you're just adding more layers of grit to your own perspective. When your mind is cluttered with the grind, you can't see the simple solutions sitting right in front of your face. Clarity isn't a luxury for the lazy. It's the primary engine of the 1% who lead, while others just follow. If you don't take the time to clean the lens, to plan, to automate, and to breathe, you're just making noise." Thomas stared through the clear glass, seeing the mountain slope differently for the first time in his life. But seeing the mountain is one thing. Moving the water without a single step is another. Richard was about to reveal the 3 forbidden laws of leverage that turn a bucket carrier into a master architect. These laws are the foundation of everything you've been missing, And the first one is going to make you realize that 80% of what you did today was a complete waste of time. But to use them, you have to be willing to do something that makes most people feel incredibly guilty. Richard laid out the first law with the confidence of a man who'd seen empires rise and fall. Stop being the engine and start being the architect. Most people are just like Thomas, carrying heavy buckets back and forth until their joints start to creak and complain. Real leverage means building a system, an aqueduct, that does the heavy lifting while you're tucked away in bed. Whether it's software, automation, or a solid delegating hand, you want a pipe that flows without your physical presence. Next, he spoke of focus, the surgical art of hitting the one stone that brings down the entire crumbling wall. Busy people think doing everything is a virtue, but it's actually just a noisy lack of strategic direction. The elite spend 80% of their energy finding the right tree to cut, and only 20% actually swinging. It's about choosing the high-impact moves that render 1,000 small, annoying chores completely unnecessary. Then there's the void, the quiet space where those million-dollar ideas finally have enough room to land. You simply can't receive a new insight if your brain is constantly buzzing with the static of the daily grind. Strategic rest isn't laziness. It's the sharpening stone that keeps your mental edge from turning into a dull butter knife. Thomas listened, realizing how stubborn he'd been, clinging to his exhaustion like it was a warm safety blanket. But understanding these laws is one thing. Seeing them survive the whispers and scoffs of a world that values sweat over systems is another. Thomas was about to do something that looked like quitting to everyone else, but was actually the most productive move of his life. In a moment, you'll see the aqueduct phase in action, and how he achieved a 40% jump in results while doing 60% less work. But first, you must learn the rule of the first bamboo joint, which is the secret to starting any system without burning out. Thomas didn't rush back to the stairs the next morning with a new and improved attitude for more self-inflicted pain. Instead, he sat on a mossy rock and watched how the morning dew trickled down the mountain's spine. He was finally using his head for something more than a place to hang a heavy wooden shoulder yoke. He realized that gravity was a far more reliable worker than his own two trembling, sun-scorched legs. For 3 days, he didn't carry a single drop of water, which made the other grinders whisper and scoff. They thought he'd finally cracked under the pressure, giving up when the monastery needed him the most. But Thomas wasn't lounging. He was engineering a future where the stairs were for walking, not weeping. He was mapping the path of least resistance, gathering a team to build a network of hollow bamboo pipes. He wasn't forcing them to march till they dropped. He was giving them a system that multiplied their collective effort. They were building an asset that would pay lifelong dividends. The clatter of buckets was being replaced by the rhythmic sound of a system being tapped into the earth. Thomas had stopped being a bucket carrier and became a systems builder. But building the pipe is only the beginning. Most people start building their aqueduct, only to have it leak or burst because they haven't cleared the internal stones that sabotage their progress. In a moment, you'll see the staggering mathematical proof of what happens when you stop fighting the mountain. But first, I need to show you the one mental shift Thomas made that ensured his bamboo pipes never ran dry, even in the hottest summer. Within weeks, the monastery wasn't just surviving, it was absolutely drowning in cool, fresh water. Those bamboo pipes worked around the clock, never asking for a lunch break or a nap. The old stone basins were overflowing, and for the first time, nobody had to ration a single drop. It's funny how a little thinking time results in a tidal wave of success that brute force could never touch. Let's look at the numbers, because the cold, hard math of leverage is where the real magic happens. Thomas's total output shot up by 40%, yet his physical strain dropped by a staggering 60%. He wasn't a tired wreck anymore. He was a strategist who had mastered the art of doing more with less. With the aqueduct of his life running smoothly, Thomas finally had the one thing he used to kill for: time. He wasn't gasping for air on the stairs anymore. He was sitting in the garden, sharpening his mind. His heart felt light, his focus was surgical, and that heavy burden he used to carry had completely vanished. The suffering he thought was a requirement turned out to be just a bad habit he finally managed to break. In that stillness, he finally felt a spark of true enlightenment that all those years of grinding never touched. But Thomas's transformation wasn't just about water. It was about realizing that the heaviest stones he carried weren't even made of rock. They were the expectations and weights he had allowed others to place on his shoulders. You might think you're just busy, but in a moment, I'm going to show you how to identify the 3 invisible stones currently crushing your potential. and the exact page in my guide where you can find the permission to finally set them down. Most people are still carrying those heavy, leaky buckets today without even realizing it. They spend their lives running on a treadmill of effort, going nowhere fast with a dull axe in hand. It's high time you ask yourself if you're actually winning or just making a whole lot of noise. Real success isn't about how much you can endure, it's about how much you can effectively eliminate. Being proud of your blisters is like being proud of a broken compass that keeps you walking in circles. The world doesn't pay for your sweat or the amount of hustle you post on social media at 3 a.m. It pays for results, the clean water, the finished building, and the problems you actually solve. If you want to join the 1%, you have to stop valuing the struggle more than the solution. Look yourself in the mirror and ask the hard question, are you moving mountains or just making noise? 1 hour of strategic thinking will always outperform 100 hours of blind, frantic hustle. But there is a reason you haven't been able to set those buckets down yet. It's because you've been taught to believe that these stones, these burdens of expectation and manual labor, are actually yours to carry. In the next few moments, I'm going to show you the exact mechanism to release that weight once and for all. You are about to see how to transition from the engine of your life to the architect of a machine that works while you sleep. But the most critical piece of this puzzle is a secret about saying no that most people are too afraid to hear. The gap between the 1% and everyone else isn't a gap in effort, it's a gap in leverage. If you're still betting on working harder to save your future, you're playing a game that's already rigged. Success isn't found in the weight you carry, but in the aqueducts you build to carry it for you. But here is the truth that Thomas learned too late. You cannot build a system for success while your hands are still full of old heavy buckets. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. Just like Thomas, you might be proud of your burnout, treating it like a trophy, while your results stay exactly where they were. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created a guide to help you drop the buckets and start building your path. It is called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours. This isn't just a book, it's the sharpening stone for your mind. It contains the exact framework to identify which stones are yours to move and which are simply draining your soul. And because I want to ensure your aqueduct never runs dry, when you get the ebook today, I'm including 2 essential tools. Bonus 1, Learning to Let Go. The specific mental exercises to release the ego of the grinder so you can finally see the path of least resistance. Bonus 2, When Saying No is an Act of Self-Love. The architect's secret to setting boundaries that protect your time and energy from the bucket carriers around you. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. Stop being the engine of your life and start being the architect of a machine that works while you sleep. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Don't just swing the axe. Sharpen your mind and watch the world move out of your way. Are you going to keep carrying those buckets, or are you finally ready to build the path?